You have exactly 3 seconds to like and subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, I'll appear in your dreams tonight. To ask for a donation for that cup of coffee, link below.
It's a pleasure to continue accompanying you all in the latest video from KTQS. On 1940, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa to invade the Soviet Union. Over a period of several months, the German army captured the entire Baltic region, and most of Ukraine. The successive sieges resulted in the Soviet Red Army suffering over 1 million casualties. In early October that year, when still 321 km from Moscow, Hitler launched Operation Sea Storm to capture the Soviet capital, hoping to quickly end the campaign without knowing that they were gambling on a deadly gamble. Moscow and the great defense that ended the German Third Reich's unbeaten run in the winter of 1941 will be reenacted in today's video. Ladies and gentlemen, with their superior military strength, the strategists of the Third Reich believed that the destruction of the Soviet regime could be counted in days. In his order dated September 30, 1941, Hitler declared, "Today begins the final, decisive battle, where Moscow stands. Today will become a vast sea that will forever bury the Soviet capital from the civilized world, with a series of victories for the Nazi German army." Throughout Operation Barbarossa, the German optimism was, in fact, not unfounded. When formulating this plan, the German Army Group Center Command continued to employ familiar tactics that had brought much success on the Western European battlefield and in the first months of the war with the Soviet Union. This involved the use of deep, massive tank assaults on key areas of the Red Army, forming 3 consecutive flanking maneuvers from Dukovshchina, Roslavo, and Shosk, encircling the main force of the Soviet army and ending the operation. According to calculations by the Nazi German army, with their overwhelming advantage in tanks, and the German army would quickly capture Moscow, similar to what they had done in Belarus, Uman, and east of Kiev. It was this optimism that led the German command to make a grave mistake, resting on their laurels. A fatal error, as you all know. Underestimating enemy has become the most serious mistake in any war. The German army's detailed plans did not include adequate equipment for a winter campaign. Operation Sea Storm was likened to a boxing match between 2 fighters, it was like a storm sweeping across the territory of the Soviet Union when Germany unleashed a massive force to attack Moscow, with nearly 2 million soldiers, 1,000 artillery pieces and mortars, along with 390 attack aircraft in the encirclement and capture plan, codenamed Typhoon, from the end of September to the beginning of October 1941. Intending to capture the Russian capital before November 7th, the anniversary of the October Revolution. Commanded by General Heinz Guderian, Sea Storm quickly gained the upper hand within its first week and easily captured several towns near Moscow. German troops broke through the Soviet Red Army's defensive lines, capturing key towns in Kaluga and Mozaisk southwest of Moscow. In some position, the Germans were only about 25-30 kilometers from the Soviet capital. Many German soldiers were able to see the gilded spire of the centuries-old Ivan the Great bell tower in the Kremlin grounds. Following the continuous news of breaches in the defenses, the people of the capital were extremely panicked, and the security situation in Moscow became chaotic and tense, teetering on the brink of collapse. An endless stream of people carrying backpacks moved along the highway, cars and trucks loaded with family belongings. At this time, people are moving out of Moscow in a manner similar to when they moved out of Vyazma, amidst the relentless bombing by Nazi aircraft. the barricades erected throughout the capital's streets, the bridges over the Moscow-Volga Canal, and the mines planted in factories. On October, Marshal Stalin and his generals unanimously agreed to hold a parade commemorating the October Revolution on November 7th in Red Square, as had been the tradition of the Soviet Union for many years. This event would have an extremely powerful effect in boosting the morale of the Soviet people and army. However, the ceremony was likely to be bombed by German aircraft, and the Soviet government leaders standing on the platform could very well become living targets for the enemy. That's extremely dangerous. The entire capital city is experiencing extremely tense days. Stalin himself only went down to his underground office when there was an air raid alarm. For the most part, he stayed in the house right next to the General Staff headquarters on Kirov Street. On November 6th, Moscow still held a solemn rally commemorating the October Revolution at the Mayakovsky subway station. On the morning of November 7th, the traditional military parade, which had been prepared in utmost secrecy, still took place in Red Square. The familiar March Goodbye, Slavo Girl resonated, stirring the hearts of the listeners. Supreme Commander Stalin read the call to arms. The whole world considers you comrades to be the only force capable of destroying the German invaders. You comrades have been entrusted with a great mission, the mission of liberation. Comrades, you must live up to that mission. Comrades, follow the courageous example of our predecessors. Let us tighten our ranks under the victorious banner of the great Lenin. The leader's call served as a signal urging the troops to march into battle, now positioned very close to the capital. At that time, the Red Army captured a German officer wearing 2 layers of clothing, his ceremonial robes over his military uniform. He claimed that the goal of the Sea Storm plan was to achieve a swift victory, so the German troops didn't bring warm clothing and were suffering terribly from the cold. The weather is getting increasingly extreme. The winter of 1941-1942 is considered one of the most terribly cold winters in Russian history. Can you imagine the deadly cold with temperatures dropping to 4-5 degrees C? It was this very thing that caused the German army to suffer approximately 800 deaths from hypothermia each day. German military equipment began to malfunction when temperatures dropped to 20 degrees C. Weapons that cannot be started, especially anti-tank weapons, recoil fluid for artillery, and lubricants for smart weapons and machine guns all freeze. The German troops were forced to retreat in the face of the fierce counterattacks of the Russian infantry, with only hand grenades remaining usable. The tank turrets couldn't rotate, and the tanks had to operate continuously to avoid freezing. Moreover, the vehicles were also submerged in mud. In the Russian T-34, which are produced in very large numbers and have pneumatic starters, can operate even in the coldest weather. Furthermore, the T-34's tracks are very wide, distributing the vehicle's weight evenly and allowing it to roll over ditches and snow-covered craters up to 1.5 meters. After 20 days of attack, the German army had advanced dozens of kilometers. In some places only 20 came from Moscow. Fierce battles took place along a front line stretching from Kalinin to Tula. Despite suffering heavy losses, Soviet army units fought to the end to defend the capital. In the battle on November 16th at Duboskova railway station and the southern Volokholamsk area, 28 officers and soldiers, General Panfilov's 316th Infantry Division fought against 50 German tanks. After 4 hours of fighting, they had destroyed 18 tanks and hundreds of German soldiers were killed, leaving almost all of them alive, with only 6 surviving. Company Political Commissar V. Klochkov issued a call to his comrades in his unit, which later became the common oath of all Soviet armed forces fighting at the gates of Moscow. Russia's vast, but we will not retreat, for behind us is Moscow. In early December, after 3 heavily damaged offensives and facing difficulties with reinforcements and supplies, the German army was halted at the gates of Moscow. From December 3rd to 5th, the entire German army group center had to switch to a defensive posture. The Soviet army gained the initiative. Germany's reserves were essentially exhausted. The German tank armies of the Central Army Group suffered heavy losses against the relentless resistance of the Soviet army. On General Zhukov proposed to Supreme Commander Stalin that the 1st and 10th Shock armies be transferred to the Western Front to organize a counterattack and push the German forces away from Moscow. In the counterattack on December 5th, Soviet corps easily breached the German lines. German weapons froze, soldiers were also freezing, and some were even stuck to their weapons. The surviving German soldiers could only watch helplessly as the enemy appeared like ghosts in the fog and white snow. At a crucial moment in the war, some German generals wanted to withdraw their troops away from Moscow. But Hitler feared that a retreat would cause chaos among the soldiers, allowing the Soviet Red Army to advance closer to Germany's borders. Therefore, the Nazi leader ordered the soldiers to hold their fighting positions to the last man, not to retreat a single step. But the German Army Group Center still pushed back westward over a depth of 150-300 km. Although the Battle of Moscow was not considered complete until early January 1942, the Soviet offensive continued to develop into a general offensive across the entire Soviet German front. During the winter and spring months of 1942, with attacks at Typhoon, Rostov, and the landing to capture the Kerch Feodosia bridgehead on the Crimean Peninsula, despite being halted at the doorstep of the Soviet capital, Nazi Germany's potential remained very strong, and it was not entirely doomed to collapse after that major defeat. Although the Soviet army had temporarily regained strategic initiative, it still lacked sufficient strong reserve forces to capitalize on its gains and achieve a decisive victory in the war. However, the Soviet Red Army's counter-offensive in the Moscow region during the winter of 1941-1942 shattered the myth of the Nazi German army's invincibility. According to Soviet Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, this was the biggest defeat for the German army since the beginning of World War II. With 1,000 officers and soldiers killed, over 700, over 50 German divisions annihilated, and over 15,000 other motorized vehicles destroyed or captured by the Soviet army. This includes the very high losses suffered by the German army during the fierce attacks aimed at capturing Moscow. On the Soviet side, the number of casualties reached nearly 200,000, including more than 6,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or captured as prisoners of war during the first German offensive in the Azov-Vyazma area. That's truly terrible. Assessing the significance and causes of the victory, Marshal Georgy Zhukov wrote in his article, "The Soviet Victory and the Impossibility of History Distorters," published in the journal, as follows: many bourgeois generals and historians blame everything on mud and bad roads. They are trying to explain that Hitler's plan to capture Moscow failed not because the Soviet soldiers were brave and their commanders were skillful and courageous, but because of bad weather, difficult roads, and ice. But I saw in the mud and on those bad roads thousands and thousands of Muscovites, unfamiliar with working in the earth and stones, leaving their comfortable city houses to dig anti-tank trenches, communication ditches, build earthen mounds as roadblocks, barbed wire fences, and carry sacks of sand. Rain and snow could not. We halted the enemy's advance in Moscow. It was an army of over 1 million elite fascist soldiers who stumbled against the steely resolve, courage, and heroic spirit of the Soviet fighters, supported by the people, the capital, and the fatherland. I wholeheartedly agree with this general's viewpoint. However, it cannot be denied that German soldiers suffered heavy losses due to frostbite and disease. In terms of objective conditions, the harsh winter was equally fair to both sides. But in terms of self-preparation, the Soviet army was more thorough than the German army. In your opinion, what other factors contributed to the victory of the Soviet Red Army? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. That concludes our journey back in time to learn about the great defensive battle of the Soviet Union. Now, on behalf of the program team, we wish you all a peaceful day.